He said it calmly, like he was canceling a meeting, not erasing 8 years of my life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I stood there steady while he smiled like this was a clean win. People ask what that moment feels like, being blindsided by someone who never learned your name. For me, it was the quiet right before everything tips, because while they thought they were cutting me loose, I was still holding something they never bothered to look for. If this sounds familiar, stay with me. Subscribe and tell me what happened when they underestimated you. I spent 8 years inside that company before anyone decided I was non-essential. 8 years learning its rhythms the way you learn a body you live inside every day. When I arrived, the place was still rough around the edges, the kind of operation where everyone knew each other's coffee order and mistakes were fixed by staying late, not by pointing fingers. We worked out of a building that still smelled faintly of dust and old paint, and nothing ran smoothly unless someone cared enough to make it work. That someone was often me. I wasn't loud about it. I didn't need to be. I was the person people called when routes tangled, when deadlines slipped, when clients threatened to walk. I learned where the cracks were, not from reports, but from being there when things broke at 2 in the morning. I remember nights when weather shut down half the region and deliveries couldn't stop, so I slept on a couch near the operations floor, shoes still on, phone buzzing every hour. I remember holidays spent watching screens instead of sitting at a table, telling myself it would be worth it because this place felt like something I was helping build, not just a job I was renting time to. Loyalty wasn't something we talked about back then. It was just assumed. We shared wins, shared losses, shared exhaustion. When a big client renewed because we held things together during chaos, we celebrated like we'd all won something personal. Over time, my role grew without anyone ever formally naming it. I became the quiet constant, the one who remembered why certain decisions were made years ago, the one who could tell you which shortcut would save time and which one would blow up later. New hires came and went, managers rotated through, but I stayed. Not because I was stuck, but because I believed in continuity, in the idea that experience mattered. That belief hardened into habit. Habit turned into expectation. Somewhere along the way, my work stopped being visible because it stopped being surprising. When things ran smoothly, no one asked why. They just assumed that was how it was supposed to be. I didn't mind, at least not at first. There's a certain pride in being reliable, in being the person who doesn't panic when everyone else does. But reliability has a cost when it's mistaken for replaceability. As years passed, the company grew cleaner, more polished, more obsessed with numbers and presentations. People started talking more about efficiency than outcomes, more about optics than resilience. I noticed meetings where decisions were made faster but with less understanding, where long-term consequences were brushed aside because they didn't fit neatly into a slide. Still, I kept showing up the same way. Early mornings, late nights, steady hands. I told myself this was what being a professional meant, that consistency would always be valued in the end. I watched younger employees burn bright and fade out, watched leadership change faces without changing direction, watched the language shift from we to performance metrics. And through all of it, I carried on because carrying on had become part of who I was. What I didn't realize then was how dangerous that quiet dedication could be when someone new arrived looking to prove themselves. Experience doesn't announce itself. It doesn't sparkle. It sits there, doing the work, assuming it will be seen. That assumption was my mistake. By the time the atmosphere started to change, by the time conversations grew colder and recognition thinner, I had already invested too much of myself to imagine being disposable. I thought history mattered. I thought memory mattered. I thought the weight I carried would be obvious to anyone paying attention. I was wrong about one thing. The people making the next decisions weren't interested in what had been built. They were interested in what could be cut. The shift didn't arrive with an announcement or a meeting invite. It crept in quietly, the way tension does before a storm. One week the office felt familiar. The next, it felt staged, like we were all standing on a set built to impress someone who didn't know the script. New leadership filtered in with confident smiles and polished language, talking about alignment and streamlining without asking what actually kept the place standing. I noticed it first in the way conversations changed. People stopped asking how things worked and started asking how fast they could be made cheaper. Questions about stability were replaced with questions about cost. Decisions that once took thoughtful discussion were suddenly rushed, signed off by people who had never handled a real breakdown. I could feel it in meetings where my input was acknowledged with a nod and then ignored, where the same idea I'd raised quietly would be repeated later by someone louder and treated like a breakthrough. It wasn't dramatic enough to confront, but it was constant enough to erode trust. Small things piled up. Meetings I'd always been part of were canceled without explanation. Emails went unanswered for days, then replied to with clipped sentences that felt more like obligations than communication. Consultants appeared, drifting through departments with tablets and forced smiles, observing without understanding, writing without asking. They never wanted context, only confirmation of whatever conclusion they'd already drawn. I watched managers I respected grow cautious, careful with their words, as if the walls had learned how to listen. There's a physical sensation that comes with being edged out, something people don't talk about enough. It's like the room loses oxygen a little at a time. You start catching yourself choosing words more carefully, double-checking work that never needed it before, staying later not because it's required, but because you're trying to prove something that should already be obvious. I noticed systems decisions being discussed without me, then handed to me afterward to implement. That was new. So was the way my calendar began filling with vague holds instead of clear objectives. One afternoon, someone from another department mentioned, too casually, that leadership was reviewing legacy roles. Another day, my badge hesitated at the door before unlocking, just long enough to make me pause. Each incident on its own was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I didn't confront anyone, not because I was afraid, but because experience had taught me that by the time signals become obvious, decisions are already moving behind closed doors. I focused on my work, kept things running, fixed what broke, answered calls no one else wanted to take. Part of me believed that consistency would speak for itself, that when push came to shove, someone would look at the history and hesitate. Another part of me, quieter but more honest, understood that hesitation wasn't what the new order rewarded. They weren't interested in depth, they were interested in optics. They wanted clean narratives, not complicated truths. I could see how this would end if I let it. Still, I didn't panic. I watched, I listened. I noted who stopped making eye contact and who suddenly became very interested in documenting processes they'd ignored for years. By the time the tension became impossible to miss, the decision wasn't looming anymore. It was already in motion, moving toward me with deliberate calm. The message came late in the afternoon, just as the office began to thin out, when people were packing bags and mentally shifting toward home. An assistant I barely knew stopped at my desk and said my name with a careful tone, the kind people use when they don't want to be associated with what comes next. Leadership wanted to see me. Now. I didn't rush, and I didn't stall. I closed what I was working on, stood, and walked down the hall, already sensing that whatever waited on the other side of that door had been decided long before I was invited in. The office itself felt different at that hour. Lights too bright, conversations muted, like the building was holding its breath. When I stepped into the room, the person across the desk didn't stand or offer a greeting. There was no small talk, no easing into it. He glanced at a document, then looked up at me, with practiced calm. "I'll keep this brief," he said, as if brevity were a kindness. He spoke about evaluations and direction, about alignment and priorities, words chosen to sound reasonable while meaning very little. Then he delivered the line he'd clearly rehearsed. My role, he explained, was no longer essential. He said it evenly, confidently, like stating a fact of nature. For a moment, the room felt suspended, as if sound itself had thinned. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I watched him continue, watched how comfortable he was dismantling years of work with phrases that fit neatly on paper. He mentioned efficiency. He mentioned modernization. He said responsibilities would be redistributed, handled externally, as though that explained everything. I noticed a folder already waiting on the desk, my name printed cleanly on the front. This wasn't a discussion. It was a performance. He slid the paper toward me, Already signed, already sealed. A termination letter effective immediately. He told me access would be disabled, that HR would follow up, that security would escort me out. Each sentence landed without emotion, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed control was absolute. What struck me most wasn't the decision itself, but the assumption that I would react the way he expected. I saw it in the slight lift of his chin, the pause he left after each statement, waiting for shock, pleading, anger. I gave him none of it. I stood there, hands relaxed at my sides, listening until he finished. The silence that followed made him uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing just slightly, as if my composure had broken the script. I thanked him, not out of gratitude, but because it was the only response that felt true. That single word seemed to irritate him more than shouting ever could have. He dismissed me with a small gesture, already turning his attention elsewhere, as though erasing me from the room would complete the process. Outside the office, security was waiting, not aggressively, not unkindly, but present enough to make a point. The walk back to my desk felt unreal, like moving through a place I no longer belonged to, even though everything looked the same. Colleagues avoided my eyes, not out of cruelty, but fear. They'd seen this before. I placed my few personal items into a box, the cardboard thin and inadequate for the weight it was meant to carry. As we moved toward the exit, I glanced at a clock mounted near the elevators. 5:18 p.m. The time fixed itself in my mind with startling clarity, not because I knew what would follow, but because I understood that this moment would divide everything into before and after. I wasn't being removed for failure. I wasn't being removed for misconduct. I was being removed to make a statement. The irony was sharp enough to almost make me smile. He believed he'd just simplified his world. What he couldn't see was that by pushing me out so cleanly, so confidently, he'd set something in motion that would never fit back into the order he imagined. I didn't go straight home after I walked out of the building. I sat in my car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the dashboard lights fade as if they were waiting for instructions I couldn't give yet. The shock hadn't landed the way people describe it. There was no shaking, no tears, no urge to scream. What I felt instead was an unnatural calm, the kind that settles in when something irreversible has already happened, and your body knows panic won't change the outcome. I took out my phone and stared at the screen longer than necessary before making one call I'd never regretted having the number for. She answered quickly without surprise, as if she'd been expecting me. I told her what happened, sticking to facts, not emotion. The time, the wording, the escort, the claim that my access had already been shut off. She didn't interrupt. I could hear papers moving on her end, the sound precise and deliberate. When I finished, she said something that shifted the air in my chest. He triggered it. I asked what she meant, and there was a pause, the kind that comes before information changes shape. She reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in years, not because it wasn't important, but because it had always felt settled. I hadn't joined the company as an employee. I'd started as an independent contractor, brought in to stabilize systems that were failing fast. The work existed before the title did. Because of that, the company never owned what I built outright. They were granted permission to use it under specific conditions tied directly to my continued role there. When that role ended, so did the permission. She said it plainly without drama, letting the meaning land on its own. In that moment, the calm I'd been holding on to sharpened into clarity. This wasn't a loophole or a trick. It was an agreement written during a time when the company needed me badly enough to accept terms they barely examined. I asked her what happened next. She told me not to answer any calls, not tonight, not tomorrow morning. She told me to write everything down while it was fresh, every detail, every timestamp, every name. She told me they would realize their mistake quickly, and when they did, they would panic. Let them, she said. I sat there long after the call ended, watching people move through the parking lot, lives continuing as if mine hadn't just been rerouted. The idea that something so quiet could carry so much weight felt almost unreal. He had believed control meant authority, that removing me ended the story. He never asked what existed before him, what had been carried forward without his awareness. By the time I finally started the car, I understood that whatever came next wouldn't be driven by anger or revenge. It would be driven by consequences. And for the first time, since the meeting, I knew I wasn't the one scrambling to catch up. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet that feels almost suspicious when you're used to waking up to alarms and urgency. I noticed the absence before anything else, the lack of messages demanding immediate attention, the stillness where pressure used to live. Then the phone started lighting up. One call, then another, names I recognized and numbers I didn't, all stacking up without a single voicemail at first, like they expected me to answer out of habit. I didn't. I set the phone face down on the table and made coffee slowly, deliberately, listening to it buzz again and again like an insect trapped under glass. There was a strange power in that restraint, not the thrill people imagine, but a steady sense of control returning piece by piece. By mid-morning, the messages began to change in tone. Short requests turned into longer explanations, professional phrasing giving way to urgency. Someone from operations asked if I'd noticed any irregularities overnight. Someone from HR asked if I was available for a quick clarification. A number I didn't recognize left a voicemail asking me to call back as soon as possible. Voice tight, rehearsed calm stretched thin. I let them all sit. I spent the morning doing ordinary things, grounding myself in routine while the pressure built elsewhere. Around noon, the calls came closer together, as if frequency alone could force a response. I imagined conference rooms filling with people who hadn't prepared for this, screens displaying numbers without understanding, conversations looping without resolution. I knew how fragile the systems were without constant adjustment, how quickly small inefficiencies compounded when no one knew where to intervene. That knowledge had always lived quietly in the background, unspoken because it didn't need to be said. Now it was absence made visible. When a message finally came from someone high enough that I couldn't pretend it was incidental, I listened to the voicemail all the way through. The voice was careful, almost respectful, acknowledging my experience, emphasizing how valued my contributions had been. It stopped short of apology. It always does. I didn't call back. By early afternoon, the tone shifted again. Politeness gave way to concern to pressure. Words like urgent and critical appeared, scattered through texts that no longer pretended this was routine. I thought about the moment the day before, the confidence with which they'd told me everything would continue smoothly, handled elsewhere. The contrast was sharp enough to be almost absurd. Still, I stayed quiet, not out of spite, but because silence was the only language left that couldn't be reframed or managed. Late in the day, a single message came through that said more by what it didn't include. It asked me to confirm receipt. No explanations, no reassurances, just confirmation. I smiled then, a small private reaction that surprised me. Not because anyone was suffering, but because the illusion of control had cracked exactly where I knew it would. They were realizing that what they dismissed as background stability was actually active, ongoing work they no longer had access to. I didn't celebrate. I observed. I followed the advice I'd been given and documented everything, times and dates, names and wording, building a quiet record while they scrambled for footing. By the time the sun began to set, the phone finally fell silent again, exhausted rather than resolved. I knew it wouldn't last. Silence, once broken, always comes back heavier. I wasn't in the room when everything finally snapped, but I didn't need to be. By then, I understood the rhythm of collapse well enough to hear it from a distance. The call came late morning, not from anyone inside the company, but from the one person who had told me to stay quiet. Her voice was steady, almost clinical, which told me more than excitement ever could. She said the meeting had started like any other, charts lined up, confident language filling the space. The same person who had dismissed me now explaining delays as temporary fluctuations. At first, no one interrupted him. That's how these things always go. People with power are allowed to finish their performance. Then a question came, simple and direct, about why operational stability had degraded so sharply overnight. He answered with confidence, blaming transition friction, external vendors, anything that kept responsibility safely abstract. Another question followed, this one about authorization. That was when the room changed. Legal materials appeared on the screen, not dramatically, just placed there like evidence no one could ignore. The language he had skimmed months earlier was read aloud slowly, stripped of jargon, reduced to meaning. I imagined his expression shifting, the certainty draining as comprehension finally caught up. Someone asked if there was an exception, some temporary allowance that could be invoked. The answer was no. Another person asked how long the exposure had existed. The answer was immediate, since the moment he ended my role. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the heavy, collective silence of people realizing a decision has already cost more than it can be undone. He tried to recover, tried to reframe the issue as a misunderstanding, something procedural that could be corrected with the right outreach. That was when someone else spoke, pointing out the broader impact. Numbers translated into consequences even the most detached executive could understand. Missed obligations, broken assurances, risks that couldn't be smoothed over with language. I listened without interrupting, without asking questions, letting the picture form on its own. She told me there was a moment when he looked around the room, searching for support, and found none. Not because people disliked him, but because accountability had finally landed somewhere it couldn't be redirected. When the decision came, it wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Authority shifted the way it always does when reality asserts itself, quietly and without apology. He was asked to step back while leadership addressed the damage. Interim measures were discussed, communication plans drafted. My name was mentioned, not with anger, but with a kind of reluctant respect that only appears after loss. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something settle rather than rise. There was no rush of satisfaction, no desire to gloat. What I felt was alignment, cause meeting effect without interference. Before the call ended, she told me they would reach out again, formally this time, with proposals. I thanked her and ended the call, setting the phone down with care. Outside, the day went on as usual. Traffic moved, neighbors passed. Somewhere else, a room full of people was adjusting to a reality they had created themselves. I didn't need to step into that room to know my place in the story had changed. What stayed with me after everything settled wasn't the calls or the meetings I never attended, but the quiet space that opened up once I stopped bracing for impact. Mornings felt different when no one expected me to absorb emergencies that weren't mine to carry anymore. I noticed how much of my energy had been spent anticipating other people's failures, smoothing over gaps created by decisions made far above my reach. That awareness didn't come with bitterness. It came with relief. I began choosing where my attention went instead of reacting to whoever demanded it loudest. Conversations changed too. People spoke to me with intention, not assumption. And when I shared my perspective, it was heard without needing to be justified by urgency or fear. I realized how rare that had been before. Walking away didn't mean abandoning what I'd built. It meant reclaiming the part of it that was always mine. I carried the knowledge forward, not as a shield, but as a compass. The difference mattered. I stopped measuring my worth against someone else's approval and started measuring it against my own clarity. There were moments when I thought about the building I'd left, the familiar corridors and routines, and felt a faint tug of nostalgia. But nostalgia is a poor reason to stay where you're diminished. Distance made the pattern clear. The problem hadn't been one person or one decision. It had been a culture that mistook silence for compliance and steadiness for expendability. Once I named that, the weight lifted. People often ask if I'd do anything differently. The honest answer is no. Not because the outcome justified the cost, but because the experience stripped away illusions I didn't know I was still carrying. I learned that loyalty without boundaries is just self-erasure dressed up as virtue. I learned that respect isn't something you earn by enduring disregard. It's something that exists or it doesn't. And most importantly, I learned that leaving isn't failure when staying requires you to become smaller. The future didn't arrive with fireworks or grand announcements. It arrived quietly through choices that felt aligned instead of reactive. I didn't chase validation or try to prove anything to people who had already decided who I was to them. I built forward, deliberately, with people who valued depth over display. If there's one thing I carry with me now, it's this. Being underestimated can be painful, but it can also be freeing if you let it redirect you instead of defining you. Sometimes the real victory isn't watching someone else fall, it's realizing you no longer need to be standing in the same place when they do. I learned something uncomfortable the moment the call stopped and the silence grew heavier. Not because I felt powerful, but because I finally saw where my strength had been hiding. It wasn't loud and it wasn't aggressive. It lived in the notes I kept, the habits I built, and the patience I practiced when reacting would have cost me everything. When I was escorted out, they assumed I would scramble, explain, or beg. What they didn't see was the quiet preparation already done. I had documented decisions, saved emails, and remembered timelines not out of fear, but out of responsibility. That habit, formed over years, became the reason I didn't have to raise my voice when everything fell apart. Hidden strength looks boring until the moment it saves you. It's restraint in a meeting, a notebook at home, a choice not to delete a message when it feels petty to keep it. If I could give advice to a friend walking into a similar storm, I'd tell them this. Protect yourself quietly, because quiet protection lasts. Pay attention to patterns, not promises, and never assume fairness will arrive without preparation. What surprised me most was how calm I felt once I stopped explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. The fear faded, replaced by a steady confidence that comes from knowing your groundwork is solid. I didn't win by fighting harder, but by standing still and letting facts speak. That lesson stays with me today, especially now when pressure feels urgent. How to get started today. Write things down even when nothing seems wrong. Save emails that explain decisions, not just compliments. Notice who avoids clarity when accountability appears. Pause before reacting. Patience preserves options. Trust preparation over performance. Where have you been quietly preparing without realizing it mattered?